Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Hold My Drink, where we navigate the news and politics with a chaser of civility. I'm your host, Jen, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and imagine with us how to create a new American identity together. So, welcome to this week's Hold My Drink podcast. Today, I have Jennifer Friend with me. Jennifer Friend is a therapist in private practice in the DC area. She is also a caseworker and volunteer with an organization that I've been working with called Counterweight. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but that's how I know Jennifer. And where she's got a really interesting story that kind of catapulted her into the counterweight world, which again, we'll share with you in just a minute. But before we do, first question is, Jennifer, what are we drinking for our conversation today?
Well, I have two drinks. So I have a vodka and tonic.
Oh, yes.
With a very generous squirt of lime. And since it's a little early in the day and it might make me sleepy, I have a cup of tea. So I'm very prepared.
You know, it's funny because I like doing this podcast. I feel like I always need to have a new kind of drink, like so I don't get bored. And this is like a public service announcement to all of our listeners. Tell me what to drink and I'll go do it. Or, I'm going to actually go find some drink, companies and but I've got something that I've had before, so I'm not exciting, although it is exciting. I put peanut butter whiskey in my coffee.
Oh my gosh.
Isn't that amazing?
Heaven.
Yeah. Yep. So yeah, this peanut butter whiskey, I'm going to reach out to them first. Support me because I drink your whiskey all the time in my coffee.
Absolutely. Make a donation.
Exactly. All right. So counterweight, and before we get into counterweight, I would love to hear your story of why you're even with Counterweight. You have a really interesting story. Let me back up. Counterweight deals with social justice. It's an organization that weighs in on liberalism, is its tagline. And they talk often against what's called critical social justice for our listeners who aren't familiar. And they definitely see a difference between social justice and critical social justice. And you recently had to experience that difference in your own life and in your own work. So share with us what that looked like.
Well, it was not a very pleasant experience. I was working for Fairfax County government as a therapist and a case manager for 15 years. And they started an equity policy, but the equity policy took a critical race theory and critical social justice approach to diversity, inclusion, and equity. And they posted on their equity website for employees a group of articles, podcasts, and videos that were supposed to aid us in understanding equity and learning more about equity. And they were actually virulently racist. There was an article stating that white women conspire with the police to murder Black men. There was a podcast making fun of white women, calling us Karens and Beckys, making fun of our lattes and saying that by a certain age where Beckys become Karens and we've reached maximum entitlement and casual white supremacy is the norm. And there were just all the usual articles on the website, Robin DiAngelo, that kind of thing, all very much, I think, very divisive in nature and painting all white people as white supremacists and racists. So it was really upsetting, and I thought that it was bad enough that somebody had to say something about it. And so I sent an email that was agency-wide complaining about the material. and calling it out for what I see it as, which is racist and divisive. And the the response was to try to defend the material, and by the higher ups, they send an email trying to defend the material, and then I publicly quit, saying that the agency no longer represented my values, which is true.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think what people don't understand and what Counterweight is trying to do is it's not that anyone involved with Counterweight, ourselves included, I would say, eh, we believe in liberal values, we believe in diversity, we believe in anti-racism. Uh, it's just the method that has been popularized through critical race theory, through unconscious bias training, which is also premised on the implicit association test, which has been shown to be completely fallacious. And so there's this sense, though, and this is pushed through the critical race theory, that if you push back, then you're racist. If you don't say anything, then you're racist. If you cry and you realize, and feel bad about what you're learning, then you're racist.
Yeah.
And there's no win-win, and there's no really empirical evidence for a lot of what D'Angelo and critical race theory goes through. And so what's disheartening to me is people like us who are having these conversations will, often are like labeled, well, you're fragile. Because this is how D'Angelo says it, you're
Yeah.
fragile, white women's tears. And it doesn't allow for a conversation that would actually make the difference in racism in our country.
Yeah, that's exactly what I think. It's just full of traps. No matter which way you turn, it's evidence against you.
Right.
And it's such a dysfunctional way to go about it. And part of what I loved about my work at the county was that I worked with people from all over the world, all different backgrounds, all different races, and it was wonderful. And my colleagues were from all over the world, and all of us got along really well. And I think this stuff is so divisive in the workplace. It does not help anybody. And I feel like it's also really negative towards the clients, because if you're training a group of therapists to see all white people as oppressors and all Black people or people of color as victims, I feel like that could start to taint how we treat our clients. And then that's interfering in the clinical work. So I was really opposed to it from that angle as well.
And I've been interviewing quite a few people. I think there is also a pushback from some people, even in the Black and Brown communities, because it is, I always say this word, you get tongue tied, infantilizing.
Yes.
Like that, there's no agency. You are only oppressed. That's all you've ever known. You can't do anything about it. And so not only is it divisive where the white people in these programs are sometimes confused or vilified. I think that it also infantilizes, and then by doing so perpetuates racism, perpetuates negative stereotypes, and keeps us in this cycle. And that I have a problem with that too.
Yeah, exactly. It does. I think it's quite demeaning and dismissive of people of color and their strengths and their skills, and the fact that they are also individuals and have different stories and different perspectives on this. And this is really assuming if you're white, you're this way, if you're a person of color, you're that way. And that's part of what makes it divisive.
And it's, I think, also, I don't know the history of critical social justice and how it kind of worked its way into, I mean, I know a little bit of the history. And of course, Helen Pluckrose, who started Counterweight and is the editor for Aereo and also has the book Cynical Theories. For anyone interested, she kind of goes into the progression of critical social justice in our society. But I think that it, with the advent particularly recently, I would say maybe in the last decade, it feels that instead of progressing, we've been regressing, and we've created groups. And I think this is where identity politics actually really caught on in the past decade as a result of our adherence or the popularization of critical social justice, because it lumps you into groups and group identities that are more important than the individual. So it really creates that tribalism.
Yeah, that's such a good description of it. It does. And it makes, I tend to view things through the lens of a therapist since I am a therapist, and it makes no sense to me because part of healing work is seeing each person as an individual and
Mhm.
recognizing their unique individual experience and not making assumptions that you must have had a Black experience or a white experience.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just it is flattened all of us.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, so tell me, so okay, someone comes to you. Counterweight is there mainly to help people dealing with this stuff in the workplace and how to um, help them to navigate critical social justice issues in the workplace. Someone comes to you. Can you give us a hypothetical situation of why someone may come to you and what you can do to help them? What would be some of the steps that you would take to help someone in a situation that struggling the way you were struggling in your previous position?
Oh, sure. And yeah, and I'll start by saying that Counterweight was really wonderful to me when I was going through that. They offered me a lot of support, and just knowing that they were there kept me strong because when people encounter this, they really go through pretty intense emotions. Um it's very intimidating to people when their employer tries to force a particular ideology on them because your employer is that's who pays you, and in the United States that's where you get your health care. This is how we pay our mortgage. This is where we have all of our benefits. So people feel like if I don't go along with this, I could lose my job or I might not get promoted, and sometimes they're right. That is what happens. And so people typically come through um, because this is being imposed on them at work. Maybe they're being forced to take unconscious bias trainings. Maybe they are forced to go to other trainings that really disagree with their values, and they're being asked to proclaim values that they don't share, such as all white people are racist, that kind of thing, or to embrace the concept of white fragility. And so people come to us seeking advice on how to push back against it. There's a lot of trouble with this in schools and universities as well.
Yeah.
And so we typically encourage people to see if there's anybody else around them that shares those concerns. So they're not the only person approaching this with their employer or school. And then we help them based on what their goal is. We help them to create a response that is productive, respectful, and to basically open a dialogue that there might be a different way of doing this. So we've had people, for example, who their goal is to make unconscious bias training voluntary instead of mandatory. And so we have sample letters that people can use, sample
Mhm.
responses people can use to address this with their employer. And people are having some success doing this. A lot of employers have bought these diversity packages and they don't really know what they bought
Right.
because
Yeah.
they're going by the label. And of course,
Right.
we all want diversity. And so it sounds good. And they don't realize that what they're doing is handing their employees a package of critical race theory and they don't know what's in it. They really don't. And sometimes they don't know that unconscious bias training has largely been debunked. And so some employers are very open to being educated and to hearing proposals for something different, to take a different approach. Sometimes they're not. They really have, sometimes an institution has just been taken over by critical race theorists, and then it's much harder. But so that's what we do at Counterweight. And then also we offer emotional support because people become really stressed, especially if they get into an argument with their employer about this, and then their employer starts coming down on them, maybe taking them off a promotion ladder or penalizing them in some fashion. People are having difficulty sleeping, having difficulty concentrating. People are getting quite anxious. People are experiencing depression. And for some people, it's a traumatic experience because it's really intimidating to basically be painted as a racist by your employer, which is happening to some people who are very much not racists. So people also need quite a bit of emotional support as they go through this.
One of the best scripts that I wrote for Counterweight was offering, because again, it's not saying that we shouldn't be doing this. Counterweight's position is not, but it's a better way. So I love, Urshad Manji, who we're going to be talking to soon. She's got the Moral Courage College. You've got
Yeah.
Chloe Valdery, who's got Theory of Enchantment. There's the Open Mind platform, which is awesome and free. You don't have to pay whatever D'Angelo's price tag is right now, $100,000 for a couple hours. But there's again, it's still this promotion of diversity, but with compassion, with
Yeah.
humility. And I love Moral Courage College. I love what Chloe Valdery's doing. And I think that you're right. I think a lot of times, I mean, I see it kind of 50-50. I'm sure you do too. A lot of times I feel like if people just knew, oh, we could still do diversity training. It's just called Moral Courage College and not White Fragility, or Theory of Enchantment, Chloe Valdery's. Then there's that more openness, whereas you're not trying to shut as the employee, you're not trying to shut them down. You're just saying there's a better way. There's another way.
Yeah.
But I do also feel though, and we've even seen this, Jennifer, we've seen this fight even in our government about a lot of the training that the government is asking employees to do, the US government, is based on critical race theory.
Yep.
And I know that when Trump was in, he tried to take that out, and now it's coming back in again. As a matter of fact, one of my family members who's in the government was just told that they would be going through this training. And I said, well, funny, you're, I have some other alternatives, but you're talking to the government at that point. I mean, the government, hi, could you do Moral Courage College? It's not like talking to your boss who's in charge of 25 people.
Yeah.
And so how to grassroots this up to the top is going to be challenging, because I feel like critical theory and the history of it, and I mentioned this earlier, its seeds were planted back in the 60s. It really gathered steam in the 70s. And obviously it started in academia, and it takes a couple of years, there's a couple of generations, but it's now infiltrated most of, I think, how we operate in society. And so that's the challenge, is saying there is another way. I'm not trying to shut you down. I'm not trying to cancel you. And that's
Right.
that's something interesting. So I've been seeing a couple articles lately that was talking about how people who were talking against critical race theory, that they themselves were engaging exactly in the cancel culture, hate that word, whatever, that they say that critical race theory engages in. And here's the thing. Critical race theory is fine as itself, as long as there are other options alongside it. If that is what speaks to you as a person and you buy into it, great. But critical race theory teaches in its own teaching that it is the one true ideology.
Right.
So if you were to have a diversity class where it's like, hey, by the way, here's critical race theory, study on it, learn on it. This is how they process it. This is like the history of it. Here's Moral Courage College and humanism,
Mm-hmm.
Then I think that allowing people to recognize that there are problems in the society, but then to be educated instead of training. Amna Khalid, who is coming out in a podcast of ours, she said something so brilliant. She goes, I don't like the name training, because it's just like there's one way that you get on board, or you get off the bus.
Yeah.
What about diversity education? And that way you can bring in voices like critical race theory. Here's one way that we do it. Here's another way that we do it, and allow our us to exercise our minds.
Right. Right. And to engage in your own thinking around it. I mean, that's the problem with it because it is a theory,
Right.
which there are many theories. And but it's gained so much cultural currency. It's being treated as if it is the absolute and only truth, and that any deviation from it, or even any innocent, well-intended questioning of it, basically gets people labeled with
Mhm.
really horrible smearing labels. And that's what's problematic about it.
Mhm. Well, more than just labels, and we've seen it. You've seen. I mean, you had the agency to leave your position, but I mean, people are. I mean, I know that some of my work. It's funny. Someone asked me the other day. I think I told you this on the call. Are you right wing? I'm like, are you freaking crazy? Like, like, just for me, for wanting to have a dialogue and wanting to be not to succumb to dogma, but wanting to think critically because I care so much about getting this right, because I care so much about equity. And the way I see that we're doing it is not necessarily taking us in that direction. But if you just even question it, I was just, what? Did you, no one has ever called me right wing before.
Yeah. It's, I think some people really are just they're just trying to basically shut down dissent, and other people, I think, don't really realize what they've signed on to. And for me, any approach to diversity should be based on our shared humanity,
Absolutely.
and that we want everyone to do well. And that's why diversity is important, because we're all human at the end of the day. We all care about our families, and we have that shared human experience. That's what we should be highlighting, is that we're all human. If you take it from the humanistic perspective, that's what could drive I think a healthier, better movement, is our shared humanity. If you take it from a spiritual perspective, you could say we're all children of God, however you want to look at it. But this is pulling people apart and pitting people against each other on the basis of race, but also on the basis of if you agree or disagree with this approach.
Hmm. Hmm. It's very polarizing that way.
Yeah,
um,
I know. It's just like, ugh. It's hard.
what are some other ways that if someone were to come to you and let me ask you this, and I
Yeah.
know that Counterweight is working on this also with trying to build a legal team. So awesome. They've got caseworkers and a mental health team, a therapy team. Um, do you see that if someone were to come and say, "Hey, I've been fired because I didn't want to do this mandatory um, critical race or unbiased training," are there outlets for them? I mean, Counterweight is fabulous because it's the support network. It gives you the words, it gives you the language, it gives you the background, and I know they're working on the legal part too. I mean, but in your experience, is there a, if someone were to get fired for simply disagreeing with something, not for being an asshole.
Right.
Because there are people who are just being jerks,
Right.
who are against this CRT, and I think what you just said, we need to come from it as a place of humanity, and even seeing the humanity in people who think differently or who might promote CRT. But if you were to, everything that happens and you provide the other alternatives that we talk about, is there other recourse though? Because it is frightening. It is frightening when you have a mortgage to pay and kids to feed, uh food to put on the table. I mean, it's just like we are being, what's the word I want to use, we are being not groomed, but we're being pushed into silence
Yeah.
and
Bullying.
bullying. Yeah, yeah, it's easier to be quiet. It's easier to, I've got my own thing, I've got my own life to live, whatever, get through this, put food on the table, tomorrow's another day. But if you actually are fired for this, are there any other recourses for you?
Yeah, I have not yet had a case at Counterweight where someone's been fired. I think there's definitely a threat of that. And so we do have some um, lawyers that are able to assist people, and also anybody who has been discriminated against or fired unfairly because of that, they could file a claim with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC.
Mhm.
But yeah, like I said, we haven't had that case yet. I I hope it doesn't happen, but I don't I don't think that that's necessarily not going to happen. It depends on how rigid your employer is.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
there's definitely the bullying component to it. This is what everybody worries about, is being fired. And when I spoke out at my workplace, people I didn't even know wrote to me and thanked me and said, I have been so upset about this, but I can't speak out because my entire family's on my health insurance,
Right.
or I'm a single mom.
Right.
And so a lot of people disagree with this approach and really are in a very difficult position and don't want to take that risk of speaking out.
I've heard that time and again, particularly in academia, both from teachers as well as students who just feel like, I'm not here to rock the boat, trying to get a degree, but that feel really uncomfortable in the
Yeah,
way we're talking about these things.
yeah, and we've had a few students come seeking help through Counterweight, and they are students who dissent from this or question it, or don't just don't want to take this particular approach, are having trouble with their professors basically giving them poor grades, coming down on them in a variety of ways. It just, right now, critical race theory and critical social justice is being woven through our institutions,
Yeah.
corporations, government, our education, K through 12 and college.
Hmm.
It's really, I'm still I hesitate when I speak because I'm still honestly in a bit of a state of shock over how it happened seemingly to me so fast. I know this has been going on behind the scenes, and then it kind of just really picked up momentum. But as I talk about it, I still go in and out of a sensation of this surrealism. Like, we can't
Yeah.
really be having this conversation, you
Yeah.
know?
Well, I mean, I just think that if, if not for people like you speaking out, I don't think that there would be a change in the dialogue. So just so thankful for your courage. And as a matter of fact, I was talking to a friend the other day who is very, very liberal, but he's very, very against what he calls the illiberal left. Although he's also very against the right as well. I mean, he's definitely he's left. Um, but he was just saying, he goes, wokeness has become a dirty word. And I was like, whoa, really? I was like, what are you reading? Because I would love to see that. And I actually started to look into it a little bit more. And there is, I don't think we're alone anymore. I do think that there is a momentum. I think they're still kind of being labeled and poo-pooed as though that's coming from the right. But there are enough people like yourself, like the people at Counterweight, like my friend who has his own podcast who's very liberal, enough liberal voices who are saying, no, no, that, and so I don't know. I kind of got excited when I heard him say that, because I hadn't really seen what was seeing that was suggesting that some people are saying this isn't the way that we do it. So maybe we're riding a wave.
Yeah, I have a lot of hope. I think there is reason definitely to be hopeful because more people are becoming aware of this. I think honestly, in the beginning, when this first started kind of coming into the schools and into people's jobs, they thought, oh, oh, good. This is got to be a good thing. If it's about diversity and inclusion, that's got to be a good thing.
Right.
But people are starting to become more educated, and I think especially when parents find that their kids are being exposed to this in the schools and how hostile and harmful some of it is, they're starting to stand up. So I think we will get a critical mass of people asking for a different approach, but it's just been a bit slower than I would like.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's happening. I really do.
Well, I hope that it happens, yeah, a bit slower than I'd like to. I hope it happens quick enough though for our children because, one of the things I did a diversity training and and it I I thought it was there to promote diversity. It was really there to talk about whiteness. And what was so disappointing to me was, and I've mentioned this before, I've mentioned it in a podcast with Alana, where we were told to write down like white sins, which, as I said then, and I say now, there are plenty. There are plenty, But I worry that, our kids who are white being told, you're rapists, you're violent. I mean, these are the things that were the white sins that we laid out,
Oh,
or
wow.
that were laid out. I didn't, but it was like, again, this goes back to that blanket identity. I mean, you have got violent rapists in every single, you know, racial, ethnic category. And so without that discernment for a young brain to be able to see beyond some of the dogma that's being pushed, I think that could seriously stunt not only diversity but the growth in for our children, the mental growth of our children, both psychologically with things that you deal with therapy, but just even like educationally. I just think that stunts when you become the oppressor, and therefore then you're seen as, you become oppressed because that's all you see everywhere. And that's a frightening message. So I'm happy to hear that perhaps the tide is turning. But I agree with you. I hope that it turns in quick enough where our kids develop a healthy respect for diversity that comes from a place of humility, compassion, and humanity.
Yeah, that's where it bothers me the most too, is when I think about little kids, because to be told basically that you're white, so you're a carrier of all these terrible things. You're a carrier of white supremacy, and you're responsible for the legacy of slavery in the US, even though you weren't alive yet. And then to basically tell Black kids, hey, white people are really against you. What that must feel like to them, how frightening and lonely that must feel, and how hopeless it must make them feel.
Hmm.
I think it's just absolutely toxic. And I think there's a way to teach history where we look at the good things the US has done and the harmful things that the US has done. And to also realize that all countries have a history of doing some really great things and some really shameful things. And we're not alone in that. And I don't see it as there's white sin. I see it as, if you're going to talk about sin, it would be human sin, right?
Hmm.
We
Hmm.
all fall short.
Hmm.
We all do things that are less than, um, you know, what our best side would do. And that's part of the human problem. And again, that's part of our shared humanity.
And I agree with you. I think to the extent that there should be a correction, this goes back to what I was saying. Instead of diversity training, diversity education, where I think that we do have to have an honest history. I mean, where to the extent that history was written by the victors, we need to go back and wrangle with the truths of our history. And in that way, I think we are creating a true movement of diversity where we recognize the good and the bad and the ugly, and we move through and make the corrections together. through education versus this kind of ideological training.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't really see critical race theory as the way it's being imposed. I don't see it as an educational tool. I see it
Right.
as a theory that's become synonymous with a movement.
Hmm.
And it's really people who are the strongest proponents of it. It's really kind of like a religion for them. And they're
Indeed.
fundamentalists. They don't tolerate
Indeed.
any deviation from it
Indeed.
whatsoever.
Indeed. But I would say you're right. Absolutely, 100% agree. But it's being used in education. I
Yeah,
mean, we are changing full education systems, including things like science and math,
I know. I know.
based on this, which again, like you mentioned, it's a theory. It's a theory that should be explored. It's not without its own merit, but everything is being changed on a theory that claims one truth in a religious fervor that has us teaching math differently.
Yes, yes. Did you see that thing? I forget where it's from, but it said white supremacy shows up in the classroom when the focus is on getting the right answer. That's a sign of white supremacy.
I mean, that's a if I was a person of color, I would find that offensive.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Infantilizing, right? It's kind
Hmm.
of suggesting that perhaps people of color can't get the right answer, so we're not going to even require that. And it really, I sometimes think that some of the schools that are failing, that have really poor literacy rates and where the children are really behind in their math scores, this is a great way of deflecting attention from that.
Interesting. Hadn't
Easier
thought
to
of it.
do this
Yeah.
than and just regurgitate this critical
Hmm.
race theory.
Hmm.
It's easier to do that than it is to figure out why those schools are failing and bring up their educational standards so that all of the students can succeed. This isn't helping children that are falling behind. It's not helping black children to succeed by doing this.
It almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Hmm.
Instead of what you said, deflecting, you're instead of like focusing on the problem to actually teach and change the system, we're just perpetuating it.
Yeah,
Oh, it's not your fault. You know, don't worry, it's because math is racist. That's
right.
not helping anyone. And then, like I said, it comes
No,
down to we care about this issue so much. This is just, it makes my head explode.
no. I know, it's actually eliminating opportunity by focusing on that instead of repairing the broken education system. It's eliminating
Hmm.
opportunity for people of
Hmm.
all races.
Of
It's
all races.
just horribly wrong.
All right. Well, I'm almost done with my drink. Let's try to end on a good note. What are
Ab- it's so depressing. It's hard to talk about this stuff without spiraling, isn't it?
right? Well, and that's why I put peanut butter whiskey in my coffee.
Hey, this is going to turn us all into day drinkers, you know?
My husband got tired of buying me bottles of wine, so now he just brings back a box of wine a week. So there's
Yeah, I
that.
think everyone's drinking more and eating more since the pandemic.
Uh, it was fine. I mean, I'll end on a really good note. We touched on this already. I love what you're doing. I love that there are resources like you in the world that are approaching this with humanity, humility, and compassion. I think those are kind of the three things that I try to focus on. I love that we're working together. I love being your colleague in Counterweight. I think that we are riding a wave that hopefully just continues to grow and gather steam. And for listeners out there who are dealing with these problems, there is a resource in Counterweight. So check it out. It's counterweightsupport.com.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, thank you. Thank you for everything you do, Jennifer. You bring me hope.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for all you're doing, and thanks for having me on today. It's been really fun.
It's been fun, and I'm so glad you brought your vodka tonic with you.
I'm going to try some of that peanut butter whiskey for sure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes for links to source material and to our website where you can find what each of us is reading every week, different news with different views. If you have a topic that you would like us to explore, drop us a line. And join us next week as we say, hold my drink, and the conversation gets real.